This is not the title that you have for my talk. I'm not, unfortunately, able to tell you in what respect it differs. But this is taking a view of conservation of grassland, if you like, considering the flock or the herd as not just a machine. As we know, animal breeds have been the product of the human intervention on wild animals. They are, to a great extent, human designs, and they carry out economic and other functions. Our principal interest is in the plants when we're concerned with high nature value grassland, but also, of course, with the animals and the other biodiversity associated with it. The animals themselves, if they are a native breed, they are part of global biodiversity, and countries that have signed the Convention on Biodiversity have taken on the responsibility of conserving and making available for general use the breeds that they have as native species, as native livestock. Another thing to remember is that the livestock, the sheep or the cattle, are also part of a farmer's business. They may be providing environmental services, but every farmer is interested to some extent in profit. They are businesses we are talking about. And the economic significance of livestock in high nature value systems, as their economic significance must not be forgotten. Inventories of the different breeds you have, and in the early stages of establishing breed societies connected with them. I may be slightly mistaken on there, but there are still lessons to be learned from what we did and what we did wrong in Britain and what we did right. Then I'm going to say something about organising conservation, and that's going to be very heavily towards policy. Whether it's policy by government, I think we'll pass over that quite quickly, or by local authorities, and the policies that are operated by breeding societies in the organisation of conservation. And then, for my third point, I'm going to consider some marketing of the products from traditional breeds, because, as I say, farmers are not just concerned with cutting the grass, they're also concerned with food security. And it's, I think, in most farmers' worldview is that they are producing products as well as keeping animals. Right, now I'm going to consider three rare British breeds of sheep. The Portlands have just fallen off the bottom of the earth. As you know, in Britain we have a flat earth system. They've fallen off the flat earth at the bottom. That's where the Portland breed comes from. Halfway up is we have the Manx Lochtan, which is from an island between Britain and Ireland, where there's a celebrated motorcycle race every year. And there's the Hebridean from Scottish Islands in the north. Now, these sheep were very rare in the early 1970s. 2016, the numbers are much higher. The Portland and the Manx Lochtan, nearly 1,000 breeding females. The Hebridean is 5,000. Now, and the number of flocks, you can see, is very high indeed. For the Hebridean, compared to the others, that's partly because the Hebridean is a breed that's heavily used for conservation grazing, because it can survive and do well on land that's got a lot of scrub invasion. We don't have juniper like you have here. We have things like gorse and various other species which can spoil the nature value of an area. The first step back in the 1970s was actually the formation of a flock book. That came before the Rare Breeds Survival Trust was formed. It was appreciated that for these breeds to be conserved, they had to have a breed society. There were no breed societies for those three, and there were several other breeds in the same situation. So the combined flock book was established, and breeders were persuaded. It usually was not too difficult to persuade them because they could see this was a necessary step. They were persuaded to add their animals into the registers, the pedigree registers of these that was run by the Combined Flock Book. Then the Rare Breed Survival Trust came along. It took over the Combined Flock Book and has acted as the breed society for the Manx Lochtan and the Portland ever since. After a few years, the Hebridean was strong enough to be its own breed society and run its own flock book. Right, numbers of flocks, they have gone up as well. In fact, I'm looking here at 1975 to 1983, and numbers of flocks stayed quite low to start with in the first few years. Publicity came, and then up went the numbers of flocks. And the Manx Lochtan showed a very rapid rise, but they all, by 1983, they were at about the same kind of level. Again, the photographs at the top, the Portland, then you'll see the funny thing, one of the many funny things about the Manx Lochtan, they often have 4 horns, or even 5, or possibly 6, or possibly 0. At the bottom, we have some Hebrideans showing the usual problems of photographing black sheep. Now, in the early stages of conservation, it was a simple matter of getting everyone to register their animals. And many animals were registered which were simply not suitable for breeding. But of course, they were part of the breed at that time. Animals which did breed, of course, you can see which those were by looking from following the flock books and pedigrees back to the start. And you can see that some animals left no descendants. They simply, their genetic contribution to the present generations, of course, is 0. But the animals which did breed are called foundation animals, and it's interesting to know what proportion of the first sheep to be registered were used for breeding. Now, this is the kind of thing where if you're setting up a breed society with a breed that's not had one before, you want to get everything to register, do you have to breed from all of those? And to some extent, your decision there will be a better decision if you can see what the experience of other people has been. Now, one test, of course, were all these 3 breeds about equal in what proportion of the foundation animals were acceptable for breeding? And because if one was very much more liberal about breeding, then the percentage of rams that would leave sons would be high. If they were quite restrictive about breeding, the percentage would be low. And it was very interesting. I did these calculations years ago, and I found actually that the proportions are very similar. Now, one of the first things to change slightly to first aid, medical assistance, if you think someone has broken a leg, get that person to put the other leg next to it. If there's something different, then there might be a problem. The same thing applies in conservation. And it's quite clear that if you look at the left-hand graph there, 33% of the Hebridean rams, 123 in that first registered group, rams, males, 33% actually left progeny. They left sons. With the Manx, it was 39%. With the Portland, it was 28%. So this is all roughly the same. It's as though there were standard farming, breeding soundness criteria that were applied. And it was much the same for all those breeds. Quite similar with the females that bred. It was 62% of the Hebridean foundation animals bred, 76% of the Manx Lochtans, and 74% of the Portlands. So, of course, there was some selection with the males that was a bit more than the selection of the females. Well, why is this relevant? If a breed is becoming recognised as needing conservation, then it's probably normal for almost all available animals to be registered. Only a few are actually used as the base for future conservation. Now, that could lead to problems, and the individual preferences of breeders might prevent conservation from being fully effective. And this is something where the breed society is very important, because the breed society is the organisation that can look at that and make sure that you're not losing essential characteristics of the breeds because of fashion or because of other reasons. And this has become quite evident with the Hebrideans. This situation has not been studied in detail, but essentially, in history, the Hebridean was described as a multi-horned breed. They were considered to be almost normally four-horned. And we have other multi-horned breeds in Britain. There's a Jacob and there's a Manx Lockton. Worldwide, there are a few others. There's the Navajo in the United States. But four-horned breeds are quite scarce. Very scarce, I should say. But historically, as I say, the Hebridean was seen as a multi-horned breed. But now, only about 7% of the females are multi-horned. So the multi-horn characteristic has been going down. That's a result of individual breeders' decisions, but it's the responsibility of a breed society to make sure that that these characteristics still exist. And this is how it's actually happened over the years. You can see the proportions of Hebrideans of each horn type. The four-horned ones are lower in the graph. The two-horned ones are above. And the rams, you see, in the first registrations, there are a lot of multi-horned ones, but it went steadily down until it's quite low from the 1990s onwards. And it was broadly similar with the females. So the Hebridean has, to a great extent, become a two-horned breed. Why? And it's because of split eyelid, entropion, as it's called. And multi-horned Hebridean sheep have got a high proportion of the upper eyelid is malformed. Today, multi-horned Hebridean sheep, about 10% of adults have a defective upper eyelid. And this is something breeders don't like, but it's not been demonstrated that it is actually a welfare problem. It just looks as though it should be, but we don't really know, but the people who keep the animals feel strongly enough about it to select against it. In very rare cases, two-horned Hebrideans have got the split eyelid. The genetic background is not clear. Okay, so there you have an example of how, in the early stages, everything was registered, brought into a flock book, and people then started practicing their own grounds of selection. As a result, today, the breed has changed, but probably not irreversibly. This has not been tested, but it ought to be tested. Have genes been lost as a result of what has obviously been going on as selection? Now, thinking about how conservation is organised at another level, we can think from the UK experience of what advice would one tend to offer. And advice can be offered to the breeders themselves, it should be offered to government, and it should be offered to breed societies. And breed societies should have what I call a Breed Society Conservation Committee. And I'll say a little bit about that. I'll go through this at reasonable speed because there's a lot of words, and those of you who are really interested in this policy side, I can provide references to take it further. If you are a breeder, join your breed society. If one already exists, don't form a new one. Now that can be incredibly difficult for some people to resist the temptation to form a new breed society. It's countless examples of this actually being, in the longer, medium term, actually rather a bad thing. But, people might decide to do that, they might not. If you want to plan selective breeding, then you should join a centralised scheme if there is one. That's not going on with the Hebridean split eyelid problem, which might be one reason why there's still so much split eyelid in the breed. If you're breeding mainly for conservation, the simplest rule of all is lengthen the generation intervals. You would tend to use older rams and just make the generation interval longer, or use a wider spread of males. to put it as non-technically as that. For the government, now I'm a little disappointed that people are obviously concerned with policy makers are not here, have left. That's a pity, because it's important that government policy concerned with environmental conservation using livestock should be aware that these breeds are part of world biodiversity, and governments have signed up to conserve this. Governments should understand completely that the Convention on Biodiversity must conserve breeds. Governments should have a national liaison committee to link policymakers with conservationists, and there should be input from the veterinary side, from the biodiversity side, and from the animal scientists themselves into that committee. Government should also, and this is a really difficult one, but we have really up against, this is a real issue in Britain, you should identify significant flocks or herds. In 2001, we had a disastrous outbreak of foot and mouth in the UK, which was very badly managed, but it resulted in everything, every livestock animal, every ruminant, every pig, in very large areas of the country being wiped out. Often usually they were called dangerous contacts. There was no real evidence that they were actually carrying the disease. It was a piece of very gross mismanagement. But it did mean that some breeds were very nearly wiped out because they were very specific in their actual areas, or they were seen to be likely to be wiped out if the situation had continued or got worse. And government has to be able to have a scheme to identify these significant herds or flocks, so that if there is an emergency, that there's some mechanism for them to have special protection. The government liaison committee should routinely consider new laws, especially if they make it difficult for keepers of rare breeds. We've had all sorts of new rules about ear tagging, for example, which are very expensive ear tags, and these can be a disproportionate burden on people who are keeping rare breeds of livestock. The Government Liaison Committee, because it may be the breed societies who are keeping animals, but it's the government that's responsible under the Convention on Biodiversity. So the government has to have some role in monitoring registrations and the effective population size, with technical genetic term, and the numbers of breeding animals. And the government should also foster development of software for the monitoring of these activities. Breed societies, if there's a breed at particular risk, the priority, build up numbers. That's, first of all, don't worry too much about anything else, just get the numbers up. And then you can start thinking about breeding schemes, and you need to manage the effective population size, which is a genetic measure of inbreeding, if you like. If they're numerically strong breeds, then traditional or original lines within the breed should be fully identified and pedigrees accurately documented. It's incredible how quick a numerically strong breed can change in character. You've all heard, I expect, the Aberdeen Angus cattle. Well, over the years, Aberdeen Angus cattle in the UK have had so much genetic material coming in from the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, that a man I know called Jimmy Souter said, what about the original Aberdeen Angus that hasn't had any influence from overseas Aberdeen Angus? And he found 50 of them. That's it. Worldwide, and these are 50 in the UK. There will be others in Argentina perhaps, but in the UK there are only 50 that had not had any of this introgression from overseas. And so the Aberdeen Angus in Britain generally is quite a big animal, fast growing, big mature size. The Aberdeen Angus originally was very small, and at any rate, he set up the traditional Aberdeen Angus, and he has saved that side of the breed. But breed societies should monitor this kind of thing. All breeds should have a conservation committee, a breed conservation committee, which should check on whether genetic variation is being maintained. And they should consider using specialist software for this. How the conservation committee works, a few hints and suggestions here, which I'll just skip to keep the detail within bounds. But the basic conservation policy, it can be quite simple. Some of these genetic plans you see are hopelessly complicated to understand, and even more complicated to put into practice, because they're written by professional geneticists. And that's fine, but it's a great need for some really quite basic practical guidance. And it's very simple. Have as many active sires as possible, all siring about the same number of young. That's important. And in each generation in the entire breed, there should be at least 25 sires active, and each siring approximately similar numbers of offspring. That will help. There will need to be some planning on top of that, but that's the basic requirement to keep the genetic variation going in the breed. There's still scope for selecting for particular attributes within the breed, but as long as you have that sort of numbers, you can select for particular characteristics, but you will have enough genetic variation that you are not making selection in areas that you're not targeting. Let me put it like that. Numbers of sires can be increased. Now, a breed society can do this. They can provide a list of the recommended sires. Sires, I should have said, breeding males. Okay. Make available stored semen. That's less relevant with sheep, where artificial insemination is problematical, but very effective with cattle. Incident, we have a breed in Britain, the Shorthorn, and I did an analysis of where these dairy cattle were getting semen from, and in recent years, and there's been quite a lot of use of 40 or 50-year-old stored semen, because those animals had characteristics which Shorthorn breeders are now using. So stored semen is a very good thing. Not just a genetic reserve, it's also something for practical use. Now, breed societies, I think this has not yet been done in the UK, but it should be easy to do, and it would get a very good message across. If you don't have the same registration fee for every animal, if there's certain sires of conservation importance, have a very much reduced registration fee for the progeny. And that gives the message that, you know, these animals should be breeding and passing on their genes. There could be a standard registration fee for the first few progeny of sires, of a sire, and increased fees for later ones. And the other thing that a breed society should ask its members for their suggestions. Perhaps I should have put that at the top. Every so often, a year, a review should be made, and I'm going to skip that one in the interests of economy of time, but the points are all there. Will these be circulated, these, or presentations? Well, and I'm happy to take further questions about it. Okay, so I've considered a historical side of the conservation of a breed and some of the issues that came with that. I've then considered the policy background to breeds, which, as you can see, there are many points where policy about breeds actually has to be decided almost along with the policy about the conservation of grasslands. The two are part of the same overall aim of conserving biodiversity. So I'm going to switch to a couple of different topics now. One very briefly about how performance of traditional breeds can be assessed. And this was a trial that I was involved in a very long time ago, where there were two farms in this particular trial, and they both had mixed flocks. They both had some what I call, Hebridean or similar breeds, Manxlocht and Soe. There's a couple of others that are broadly similar to the Hebridean. And anyway, they had 18 crossbred ewes. Those are the commercial ewes that most of our sheep farming depends on. And they had about 20 of these Hebridean types, all mated with the same ram. And that's about 40, a mating group, about right for one ram. In the farm 2, it was a smaller flock. They had 20 crossbreds and 10 Hebrideans. And they're the sort of body sizes we're talking about. The crossbreds, 58 to 72 kilos for the female body weight. For the Hebrideans, it's 35 to 40. They're quite small, or bijou, perhaps I should say. But the kind of results that came out were like this. The crossbreds have had a higher litter size than the primitives, than the Hebridean type. Carcass weight higher for the crossbreds. The number of lambs sold was those are the numbers that are there. For one farm, we actually had the figures of the lamb meat produced per kilo of ewe, and you can see from this that you're getting about 50% more meat per ewe, per female, per kilo of female, I should say, than with the Hebrideans and the crossbreds. That small ewe gives good milk quickly to her offspring, and she's only lightweight, but she will produce heavier lambs considering her body size. Now, the reason for presenting this is really to say this is the kind of trial that you can run quite easily. As long as you have the same ram, the right sort of numbers of animals, you can get this sort of information quite quickly. Well, of course, this is relevant to meat production because that's where we are really in Britain with sheep. But that's and I know that meat is not your only preoccupation here. Okay, so the point from that little story is that it's quite easy for a breed society to set up a comparative trial to show to farmers that it can make good commercial, good business sense to try a different breed from the one they might expect to. Now, this is another one. This is a specific example, and this is from beef, and it's a coordinated beef production and marketing system. Quite a small scale one, but it's one which operates in a system where it's not just one farm doing the production and marketing, it involves 3 people, 3 different businesses together, coordinated, and that actually is a very, very good business model, which it might be worth some people considering. It's an extension of the farm shop principle. It's like when they say sales at the farm gate. This is sales of food and other products direct from the farm itself. Now, in the UK, we've got lots of these. Far fewer in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, and not that many in Scotland, but certainly down in the richer south. 4,000 farm shops in the UK, 1.5 billion turnover every year. That's in pounds. Euros, I think a pound is about 1.10 euros. The average annual turnover, they're quite big, they're about 250,000. A more recent one for 302 farm shops, all members of an association for this trade. Not only are they turning over 18 million a year, they're also employing well over 2,000 staff. Here we've got rural regeneration. And this is the specific example. We've got a farm in Cheshire, which is in the kind of northwest of England, and it's an informal partnership of 3 people: a breeder, a finisher, and a butcher. And each of them has a speciality. You can't be a successful beef farmer in all these things unless you're exceptionally lucky or what. These are specialist individual trades. The breeder, he has 80 hectares of high nature value lowland grassland. He gets £70 per hectare per year for environmental payments. He's conventional, not organic. Okay? This is the sort of thing one can conceive. He used to be a dairy farmer. Now he keeps traditional Herefords. Those are like the Herefords you have here. They're relatively smaller than the ones I think we have. They all carry horns, the ones I've seen. The traditional Hereford is actually recognised as a separate entity. It's obviously a Hereford animal, but it has a kind of separate breed status. He keeps 65 of these. He used to be a dairy farmer, likes cattle, but he's got his 65 traditional Herefords. He's personally interested in breeding and nature conservation. He also sells embryos and breeding animals. But from his 65 cows, he sells 10 to 12-month-old males, bullocks, castrated males, and he sells them for £600, and along with his cull cows, the old cows, to David. Right, David, just down the road. He's a specialist finisher. He doesn't just have 65 cows. He usually has about 250 on his farm. I don't know about his history. Maybe that was a big dairy farm with lots of buildings and handling facilities. I don't know the story. But he finishes Keith's cattle on grass. He's got enough grassland to finish those bullocks off, to bring them up to slaughter condition on grass. Now, Keith has sold him the bullock. Every month, Keith buys one back. It's about 550 kilos live weight. It's obviously one that he sold 12 months ago. But he buys it back and he takes it along to Callum, the butcher. So Callum slaughters it. The carcass weighs 270 kilos, hangs it for 28 days, butchers, packs and delivers back to Keith at the end of each month, not December, because they're having a little holiday at Christmas time, and he charges £300 for that. Keith sells the meat in his farm shop for about £2,500. And it's on sale from the first Saturday of each month. About a third is sold fresh, the rest is frozen, it's expensive. But he doesn't need to advertise. You see, the word has got around. Everyone knows that the first Saturday of the month is when you go to Keith to buy your rolled rump at £21 a kilo. You see, so this business has developed over 10 years. It's not the sort of thing that happens overnight. But the key to it is really that, there are six keys, really. The environmental payments, that's £70 per hectare per year, which he gets because he's keeping a traditional breed. He wouldn't get that if he had Charolais or limousines. The specialist participants, you see, each of them is doing a very specific different trade. The costings are clearly defined. You're not subsidising the finishing operation from the retail operation. If you cross-subsidise, you will never know quite what your cash flow is actually being. The costings are very clearly defined. It's a very good business model. The cash flow is predictable. He's got a very strong retail base. And another point is because Keith is breeding the animals and then selling later on, he is getting what you call a market signal from his consumer straight back to his breeding operation. If his consumer says it's too fat, then he knows that maybe he needs to keep his animals slightly differently or even use a different bull, maybe a slightly leaner animal. Right. So, this is to conclude some general principles about farm shops. Why do they fail? Because they do. And it's very often because they take on too much without the necessary planning, research, skills or capital. People who are good at running a farm are not necessarily equipped for the challenging of running a retail operation. The key advice with this is concentrate on fresh local produce. That's what people want. Don't sell too many everyday things. And if you're going into butchery, make sure you have someone who understands the high-quality meat market. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Kas on praegu Stevenile küsimusi? Do you have any questions? Yeah, Alex.
A technical question. In the example you showed, the butchery was separate. It was all very clear. But for many small farmers, this might be too expensive. So what we have found here that one of the key to survival, that is, we have an obstacle now in this country, is if it would be allowed to sell meat from animals that have been slaughtered and butchered at home, on the farm. Currently, Estonian interpretation of the relevant EU regulation is that it is completely no-go, completely impossible. I have seen in Germany interpretation of the same EU regulation that it is possible.
Yeah.
How is it interpreted in UK?
Well, but there is a problem in the UK that abattoirs have been closing.
Because of too high
no,
demand.
well, because they're too small to be economic.
But not because of bureaucratic...
No, well, actually, to some extent, there is an element of that. But now, it may differ whereabouts you are in the UK. It may differ because we have a devolved system. Scotland, Wales, and England and Northern Ireland are all slightly different. But generally, if an animal is slaughtered on the farm and then taken to an abattoir for the official meat inspection, that would be okay. But most farmers, I don't know about, certainly with cattle, I don't think many farmers would tend to kill them on the farm. I think you would have to take them to an abattoir. But this is a national issue.
But for sheep?
For sheep, I don't think... Yes, I couldn't tell you as a percentage. We have an organisation called the Humane Slaughter Association, which is aware of this. It deals with all the technical issues relating to slaughter. And they welcome overseas members. It's Humane Slaughter Association. It's a world pioneer in this. And they provide this kind of advice. At one point, they did fund a mobile slaughterhouse, which operated for a trial period. But it's very expensive to run. But this went around to central collecting points, and farmers bring animals a short distance to have them slaughtered. But yes, that's another reason for splitting among different functions. But as you say, that may be difficult in some situations. Yeah.
Then thank you, and this medicine for your deficiency you were talking about.
Thank you. Yes, I'll hold it the right way up.